Whether it be Frank Miller's grim redefinition of Batman, Iron Man's alcoholism, or even the 1996 Marvel collecting bubble pop, there are several moments in history which have changed the medium of comics forever. I'm James with Mint Hunter Comics, and let's dive into just 10 moments that changed comic book history. If you've been watching my content, please consider liking this video and subscribing, as I'm moving towards making this a full-time gig. Let's start the list off with 1954's Seduction of the Innocent. In 1954, psychiatrist Frederick Wortham exposed comics as a negative influence upon children, which would affect the comic book industry for decades. Seduction of the Innocent didn't just criticize comics for not being educational, it accused comics of causing children to become juvenile delinquents. Wortham maintained that comic books promoted homosexuality, violence, crime, and taught children to ignore the laws of physics, endangering themselves both mentally and physically. Batman and Robin were accused of homosexual undertones, Superman labeled a fascist, and Wonder Woman as a seductress and lesbian. Parents no longer wanted their children being influenced by comics and feared having them grow up violent, deviant criminals. After Wortham's findings were discussed by the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquencies, comic publishers were required to take action to reassure parents that their comics were safe to read and no longer a source of harsh impact. Thus, the Comics Code Authority was created to clean up comics, banning the over-the-top violence, gun use, horror, and even made sure that bad guys were always punished. There would be no ambiguity towards evildoers, as the heroes would always win, and right always trumped wrong. There was no room for black and white. Comics that adhered to these rules got the Comics Code Authority stamp of approval. Kids from this time period always saw their heroes as the ultimate moral guidance and had a much more innocent appreciation of comics, in comparison to that of late 80s and 90s kids. The Comics Code Authority wasn't even questioned or challenged until about 20 years later, and took over 50 years to be totally abandoned. Next up, we have the arrival of Black Panther and Falcon. Diversity was extremely rare in comics, and when it was there, it was even more rare that a minority distinction would be that of a hero. Marvel made the first jump with Black Panther in 1966, which appeared in an issue of Fantastic Four, but you have to remember how big a step this was in the 60s. Let's not forget, after all, that segregation within the US was abolished only in 1964, meaning that the Black Panther arrived just a couple years after. Black Panther was the first modern black superhero to be accepted by mainstream audiences, albeit unfortunately not accepted by all. Wanting to follow the politics of the time and allow inclusion of racially different characters, Black Panther was a bit of a controversial character. 10 years after his first appearance, he was written to fight the KKK in a 5-issue series to further establish himself as a culturally significant character for black communities. A few years after his first appearance, the Falcon, Sam Wilson, was introduced in a Captain America title in an effort to help Cap escape the exiles. Both of these characters, now modern-day favorites, paved the way for modern comics inclusion of faces that more readers could relate to. DC started a bit later with their introduction of John Stewart, Green Lantern. These characters paved the way for Luke Cage, Storm, Shang-Chi, and more diverse superheroes in years to come. And what could be more historically important than the death of Gwen Stacy in Amazing Spider-Man issue 121? Comic book deaths are as commonplace as costume changes are to Spider-Man, but sometimes they have a bit more impact. One of the most shocking deaths in comic book history was in 1973 when Peter lost Gwen Stacy over the bridge at the hands of his arch-nemesis, Green Goblin. Or was it at the Green Goblin's hands? Surely it was the Green Goblin that put Gwen in danger and threw her over the bridge, but the panel layout and the snap word text have left readers wondering for decades if the fall killed her, or if the force of Peter's webs did her in. You have to understand that even at this point in comics, the hero always saved the girl. The death of Gwen Stacy was the first time that we really saw our hero fail to save the woman he loved. And the fact that it could have been at his hands made it much more heartbreaking. This was a big deal. Many state that this ushered in the beginning of the Bronze Age in comics, a time where actions had more consequences, politics intermingled with storylines, and the pages started to feel a bit more real life. Comics never really went backwards after this moment upped the stakes. Deaths could happen, love interests could be lost. How about Speedy revealed as a heroin addict? During the 1960s, Green Lantern was on the verge of cancellation, which gave writer Denny O'Neil a great deal of creative freedom when he was assigned to the series. Artist Neil Adams responded by pushing for a story dealing with drug addiction, an issue both he and O'Neil had been wanting to tackle. There was nothing subtle about their take as they depicted Roy Harper, Green Arrow's ward Speedy, revealed to be a heroin addict to tackle the issues of drugs at the time. Initially rejected by the Comics Code Authority, DC had to fight for the issue to be approved, giving the angle that the story was beneficial in the fight against drugs in America's youth. The result is probably one of the most shocking comics ever to eventually be approved by the Comics Code Authority, and even led to various awards in addition to recharging the Green Lantern sales. Questioned why Roy Harper, Speedy, was chosen to illustrate drug abuse, O'Neil said that we chose Roy for the maximum emotional impact. We thought an established good guy in the throes of addiction would be stronger than some character we'd have to make up for the occasion. Also, we wanted to show that addiction was not limited to bad or just misguided kids. The aftermath of this issue did something unexpected, as comics moving forward started introducing vices and crutches for our favorite heroes, to show them battling more than just villains. Famously, Iron Man's Demon in a Bottle arc had Iron Man shown as an alcoholic, and while the creative team maintains it was purely alcohol being the villain of the month, and not written to be relevant, the cultural significance of these issues was felt by readers to this day. Next up, we got Crisis on Infinite Earths. Well, after many decades, DC characters and stories started to get a bit complicated. Early iterations of characters didn't match later counterparts, origin stories that didn't match each other. It all led to some real continuity nightmares, which eagle-eyed readers would pick apart for fun. While most fans probably just overlooked these, it became an itch that DC editorials were wanting to scratch. They opted to throw their best talent, writer Marv Wolfman and artist George Perez, on a massive world-ending project to undo, tie up, and recreate everything. Crisis on Infinite Earths essentially wiped out these continuity issues, the multiverse as a whole, and even several characters, all as a sacrifice to add continuity and a more streamlined reading experience to the fans. I say sacrifices because the story killed off fan favorites such as Supergirl and even Barry Allen. It also introduced fan favorite massive DC villain, the Anti-Monitor. The biggest outcome to Crisis on Infinite Earths is that it reset the DC universe and gave a fresh start to everything, which led to some pretty fantastic new imaginings for the characters, still most of which we would consider the definitive versions and origins that we know today. Next up, we have the massive push to make comics dark, with Frank Miller and The Dark Knight Returns. Before the mid to later 80s, comics still regained a youthful enthusiasm and approach to storylines, often with little to no risk, and storylines that followed a traceable thread and usually left you with a positive ending. The late 80s and 90s is often remembered as quite the opposite, with avant-garde storytelling, dark imagery, increased violence and gore, increased swearing, and a general darker tone. It's truly a stark contrast to what came before. So what happened? Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns is what happened. Miller's story about a much older Batman in a dystopian Gotham was a total break from most of Batman's earlier, campier iterations. In its place was a notable, much more adult story. It marked a huge change for the comic industry as comics began to feature more sex, violence, and psychologically troubled villains and heroes. With a slew of books that followed The Watchmen, which came out at a similar time, later Killing Joke, and Jim Starlin's The Cult, it was clear that the culture of comics was shifting from kids to young teens to adult. These graphic novels also didn't have the harsh Comic Code Authority breathing down their neck, as these were not the mainly published monthly titles. It took a while, but these types of stories later would lead to the abandonment of the Comics Code Authority. Next up, I was gonna say the death of Superman, but I'm changing this entry to everything that happened at DC between 1992 and 1994. At the turn of the 90s, comics were eager to increase sales by upping the stakes. As we mentioned, after the success of The Dark Knight Returns, Killing Joke, Watchmen, DC wanted to make mainstream comics titles dark as well, not just the graphic novels. The mainstream comics still had to be approved by the Comics Code Authority, but DC was able to see the future and decidedly wanted to push their luck. DC decided to give a whopper of a 2-year run of catastrophic, unimaginable, never-before-seen events that would unknowingly change comics forever. Superman was killed after a battle with Doomsday, Batman was snapped like a twig by Bane, and a new ruthless Batman took his place, and Hal Jordan lost Coast City and eventually lost his mind trying to recreate it, killing his friends in the process. So you add an unkillable perfect hero killed, an imposter Batman, and Green Lantern turned villain. What a time to be alive. Superman's death specifically was the first major death and subsequently resurrection for DC. What followed was a trope of meaningful character deaths that were later resurrected in later years. The death and return of Superman changed the rules for DC, opening the door for anyone to come back to life. Bucky Barnes, Jason Todd, Gwen Stacy, you name it. While some aspects of these storylines in hindsight feel gimmicky and kind of looking for shock factor to make a buck, the impact initially felt was huge. Being a little kid from this time reading these comics as hand-me-downs, I was all in. This sparked my urge to collect and fascinate over Green Lantern and Batman. Furthermore, it cemented the idea within readers that DC took risks. They started taking risks in 1992 and have never stopped since. The cultural impact is still felt today and serves as the inspiration for many more flawed heroes, many of whom are far less invincible than originally created. The end result is a more complex and interesting character. Thanks, early 90s DC. Up next is an interesting entry because it's not a storyline, rather a historical event. We're talking about the 1996 Marvel comic book bubble pop. Marvel has become so recognized and popular to the point that Thanos has become as much of a household name as that of Darth Vader. So it can be hard to believe that in 1996, Marvel was almost wiped off the map. By the late 80s, the discovery of collecting comics and the value that they could hold took the world by storm. With price guides available and comic shops popping up left and right, you started seeing vintage books and key issues reach record sales as everyone scrambled to collect and also to sell. Marvel's effort to capitalize on this plugged $700 million into toy budgets and trading cards and massively started increasing the prices of comics. The comics bubble burst, and fans stopped purchasing comics as they started getting wise to the gimmicks. Sales dropped by over 70%, and Marvel watched in awe as the seemingly unthinkable happened before their eyes. Marvel filed for bankruptcy in 1996 to pay off their debts, and tried a ton of methods to regain some of their lost money. Trading cards and themed restaurants failed, but what didn't fail was the selling of their biggest characters to various studios. Blade found some success, paving the way for X-Men and eventually Spider-Man in 2002. Now this is long before the MCU as we know today, but these movies deserve more credit because they are what sparked a massive resurgence into superheroes and the desire to see them on the big screen. As the saying goes, everything works out for a reason, and without this 1996 market flop, the MCU as we know it may have never come into existence. Next up, we're talking about Flashpoint and the creation of the New 52, 26 years after Crisis on Infinite Earths, which is hailed as DC's first successful attempt at explaining DC continuity. DC decided to relaunch all of its titles and characters again. This relaunch set a new universe and a new starting point for readers to pick up on, as well as include characters from Vertigo, Wildstorm, and Milestone characters. And it all started with a Flashpoint storyline where Barry Allen wakes up in an alternate reality in which only he's aware that the world has changed. In his attempt to go back in time again and set things right, he combined and reset several different timelines. It is later revealed that Dr. Manhattan deceived Pandora into convincing Barry to merge 3 separate timelines, which enabled him to erase 10 years from the reverted universe, which not only reversed the age of its inhabitants by 10 years, but also caused the multiple resurrections of several deceased characters. The New 52 was a bold move at a very offbeat but successful use of a rewriting tool, and remains a mind-boggling pocket of DC timeline history. And finally, the 2020 COVID comic boom. Still fresh in our minds at the time of this video, the 2020 COVID comic boom will be known for decades to come as one of the biggest boom in comic interest since the medium originated. It was a perfect storm, as the MCU was reaching new peaks, having just dropped Avengers Endgame, which was in the top 5 highest grossing films of all time. Everyone was quarantining at home and looking for new hobbies with their increased free time, and the government was giving people money. Many kids, teens, young adults, and collectors of all ages either joined or re-entered the hobby as what can truly be considered a beautiful silver lining to a very unfortunate global situation. Comic knowledge was swirling and fans were engaged. Indie comic publications soared with a resurgence of quality in the books of this time, notably Something is Killing the Children, which gained massive popularity and quickly reached prices similar to that of desirable keys from 10, 20, even 30 years ago. Even in the aftermath, as recession was imminent and the market settled down to more reasonable prices, the impact was still felt as millions of fans were now eagerly awaiting their pull lists and talking about whether Superman would win or Century. The COVID comic boom helped to bring superhero interest to an entire another generation of fans for the hobby, and has helped push superheroes into being the largest IPs that exist in all media. And let's do a quick word from our sponsor, Dynamite Comics, which 30 years now Dynamic Forces has been going, and we're going to celebrate it with a massive savings plan. I'll put a link here, but basically, customers can save 95% off on well over 150 issues worth of critically acclaimed and fan favorite titles. Just for $18 to get everything, fans will be walking away with an awesome haul of over 5,000 pages to dig their teeth into. We're talking The Boys, Vampirella, Red Sonja, and Mars Attacks, Nancy Drew, Garbage Pail Kids, Barbarella, tons more. Dynamite's also including several of the latest hits that have barely just hit the shelves, such as Unbreakable Red Sonja, Vampirella Mind Warp, Scarlet Sisters, Lady Hell, and others. This is an incredible bundle on digital comics, but that's not all. Dynamite and Humble Bumble are working alongside World Central Kitchen to contribute a portion of the proceeds from the sales around the world. World Kitchen is a non-profit organization that strives to provide meals to those in need in the wake of natural disasters and crises. You do not want to miss this 95% off, frankly ridiculously awesome sale.